400 generals of the Third Reich didn't live to see the end of the war. Only 1 in 4 of them died from an enemy bullet or shrapnel. The rest fell victim to Hitler's paranoia, internal Wehrmacht intrigue, and their own code of honor, which under total dictatorship turned into a death trap. After July 20th, 1944, the Führer personally ordered, "Treason is punishable by the death of the bloodline." Families of executed generals were sent to concentration camps. Their children went to SS orphanages. The top command of the Wehrmacht was trapped. Break your oath and face disgrace. Follow orders and lead the army to ruin. Today, we'll go from the sands of El Alamein to the concrete cells of the bunker under the Reich Chancellery. We'll find out why Hitler gave a lavish state funeral to the man he personally poisoned. We'll understand why the Lion of Defense shot himself in the woods when the Americans had already guaranteed his life. And we'll see generals hanged on meat hooks under movie cameras. July 17th, 1944, 11:45 a.m., Road D979 between Livarot and Vimoutiers, Normandy. An open-top Horch 851 staff car, license plate WH151874, was carrying Field Marshal Erwin Rommel from Army Group B's headquarters to the Führer's headquarters. At the wheel was Master Sergeant Karl Daniel, a veteran of the African campaign who had earned the Iron Cross First Class. Next to Rommel sat Captain Helmut Lang, his adjutant, who was keeping a travel log. At 12:05 p.m., 4 Spitfire Mark 9s from the RAF's 602 Squadron, crewed by New Zealanders and Brits. Lieutenant Johnny Hinton, Flight Lieutenant Frank Murphy, and 2 others spotted the 3-car column. They had just dropped their bombs on the anti-aircraft positions of the 12th SS Panzer Division Hitlerjugend and were heading back to their base at Ford Airfield in Sussex, low on fuel. No more than 20 minutes of flight time left. But the pilots saw the staff car, the distinctive antennae for radio communication with a range of up to 80 kilometers, and the Army Group Commander's pennant on the left fender left no doubt. A big shot was on board. Hinton later recalled in his post-war memoir, "I saw the flags and thought, that's a general for sure. Let's give him a burst." The attack lasted 14 seconds. Each Spitfire's 220mm Hispano-Suiza Mark II cannons fired at 600 to 700 rounds per minute. They unleashed a burst, 38 shells and 120 rounds of 7.7mm ammunition. One shell exploded by the left rear wheel, tearing off a piece of 8mm armor plate. 3 bullets hit the left side. One of them, with a tungsten core for penetrating light armor, struck Rommel's left temple at a 30-degree angle. The bone shattered into 7 large fragments and many smaller ones, the largest up to a centimeter across. Fragments pierced the brain, touching the motor cortex, causing temporary paralysis on the left side of his body. The car careened into a ditch at 70 kilometers per hour and rolled onto its side. Rommel was thrown onto the shoulder, unconscious, blood streaming from his ear and nose, his left eye unnaturally wide open. Driver Daniel suffered mild concussion and facial cuts. Captain Lang got a bruised shoulder and a split lip. A passing German ambulance, an Opel Blitz with a red cross, returning from the field hospital at Bernay, picked them up. The ambulance driver, Corporal Karl Rademacher, later testified that Rommel looked like a piece of meat, all blood and dirt. Field Hospital in Bernay, operating room number 3. Surgeon Professor Kramer, one of the best neurosurgeons in the Wehrmacht, who had performed cranial surgery since WWE, put in 14 stitches to close a tear in the dura mater. He had to remove 3 fragments lodged in the temporal lobe. Quadsbeek and its abriding and temperate by centrain, working under local anesthesia because general anesthesia was in short supply. Kremer's assistant, Dr. Hans Miller, wrote in his diary, "The field marshal's skull was like a cracked egg. We picked bone chips out of brain tissue for over an hour." Rommel's left eye stayed open. The facial nerve had been severed by a fragment. The eyelid could no longer close. Rommel survived, but 3 weeks later, something else sealed his fate. July 20th, 1242, P.M. Wolf's Lair, Rastenburg, East Prussia. Colonel Klaus Schenk von Stauffenberg placed a briefcase bomb under Hitler's oak desk. The explosive, 1.2 kilograms of hexogen with a 10-minute acid fuse, detonated. The blast killed 4 people: Colonel Heinz Brandt, General Günther Korten, General Rudolf Schmundt, and stenographer Heinrich Berger. Hitler got off with a concussion, a burned right leg, burst eardrums, and temporary paralysis of his right arm. His trousers were shredded, his hair singed. After the explosion, he told Keitel, "I am immortal. This proves it." Himmler ordered the Gestapo, "Arrest everyone whose name pops up in diaries, notebooks, testimonies, any hint of disloyalty. Screen 4,700 officers." Rommel's name came up 17 times. Major General Henning von Treschow, a key conspirator, had told his co-plotters, "Without Rommel, the coup loses legitimacy. The people won't support us if we don't offer a hero in place of Hitler. Rommel is the only commander the soldiers and civilians both love." Rommel had met with Karl Goerdeler, the civilian leader of the conspiracy, a former mayor of Leipzig, on May 27, 1944, in the field marshal's home in Ulm. The talk lasted 4 hours. Goerdeler laid out the post-Hitler government program: restore the monarchy, negotiate with the Western Allies, make a separate peace. Rommel said something Goerdeler jotted down in his notebook: "The Führer has to go. His policy is driving Germany into the abyss. But we mustn't kill him. That'd create a martyr cult. He needs a trial or a military ouster." 2 months later, those words cost him his life. September 28, 1944. Ulm, Rommel's house at Waldhausenstrasse 9. The field marshal already knew the Gestapo was watching him. A former adjutant, Lieutenant Colonel Cäsar von Hofacker, had been arrested on July 26th and tortured by the Gestapo for 3 weeks. Under torture at Prince Albrechtstrasse headquarters in Berlin, Hofacker broke and named names, including Rommel. He managed to get a note out through his lawyer, Dr. Karl Lademann. "Your name is on the list, Field Marshal. Prepare for the worst." Rommel didn't run or hide. He kept living at home, going on walks with his 15-year-old son, Manfred. On October 7th, Rommel wrote a last letter to his wife Lucy. "Whatever happens, I have done my duty. Take care of the boy." October 14th, 8 a.m. A black Opel captain with military police plates and a general's flag stopped at the gate. Out stepped Lieutenant General Wilhelm Burgdorf and Major General Ernst Meisel, both from the Army Personnel Office. Burgdorf had authority from Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, head of the OKW. The document signed by Keitel read, "Burgdorf and Meisel are to proceed immediately to Field Marshal Rommel and deliver a personal directive from the Führer." Rommel met them in his study. According to his wife Lucy, standing behind the door with her ear to the wood, Burgdorf said, trying to keep his voice flat, "Field Marshal, you are accused of complicity in the July 20th assassination attempt. The investigation has evidence that you knew of the plot and did not report it. The Führer considers this sufficient for trial by the People's Court." Rommel replied calmly, "I was not involved. I did not consent to murder. I only said the war has to be ended." Burgdorf, "The Führer gives you a choice. First, a trial, The outcome is certain. Death sentence, loss of all ranks and decorations, confiscation of property, your family, under the bloodline guilt law, sent to a concentration camp. Your wife and son will be arrested within the hour. Second, you take poison. In that case, we announce that you died from the wounds of July 17th. State funeral with full military honors, all ranks and medals retained. Your family receives a field marshal's full pension. 6,000 Reichsmarks a month, plus the supplement for the Knight's Cross with oak leaves. Rommel looked at the door where Lucy stood, then at the wall clock. He said, I choose the second option, but give me 5 minutes to say goodbye to my wife and son. Bergdorf nodded. 5 minutes, not a second more. Rommel went into the living room. Lucy was there. He hugged her and said quietly, in 15 minutes, they're calling from the hospital in Berlin. They say there's a new treatment for head injuries. Don't worry. Take care of Manfred. It was a lie to stop his wife from interfering. Then he went upstairs to the bedroom. He put on his full dress uniform. Gray fine cloth tunic, gold shoulder boards with 3 stars, the Knight's Cross with oak leaves around his neck, the Iron Cross First Class on his left pocket. He took his field marshal's baton, white with gold eagles, in his right hand. His son Manfred stood on the stair landing. Rommel put a hand on his shoulder. He repeated the same line about the hospital call. Manfred asked, Dad, is that true? Rommel didn't answer. He went out to the car. Bergdorf and Maisel were already in the back seat. The driver, SS Corporal Heinrich Dörner, started the engine. Dörner later testified that Rommel was calm, like he was going to a parade. The car drove off from the house, went 300 meters down a forest road toward the outskirts of Ulm, where there were no witnesses. Bergdorf gave a signal. Dörner stopped. Bergdorf and Maisel got out, walked 50 meters away, and stood with their backs to the car. Rommel was alone inside. The ampule of potassium cyanide was in his pants pocket. Bergdorf had handed it to him back in the study. A glass, sealed ampule, inside it white crystals with a grayish tint. Purity of the poison, 99%, produced by Testa Laboratories on SS contract. Rommel bit down on the ampule. Potassium cyanide, a salt of hydrocyanic acid, binds with cytochrome oxidase, an enzyme in the mitochondria that cells need to use oxygen. The blockage takes seconds. Cells stop breathing. Intracellular suffocation begins. Consciousness fades in 10 to 15 seconds. The respiratory center is paralyzed in 30 to 40 seconds. Death comes in about 45 seconds. Rommel's head fell back against the seat. His left eye, still open from the earlier injury, stared at the car's ceiling. The eyeball reddened, capillaries burst from the poison, foam formed on his lips. At 8:47 a.m., Bergdorf walked back to the car, opened the door, felt for a pulse at the neck. Dead. He nodded to Maisel and Dörner. Rommel's body was wrapped in a gray blanket and driven back to Ulm. At 9:15 a.m., a call went from Rommel's house to the SS hospital in Berlin to confirm a passing. At 11 a.m., German radio broadcast an emergency message. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, national hero, died this morning from a pulmonary embolism, a complication of wounds received in action against enemy aircraft on July 17th. The Führer offers his deepest condolences. October 18, 1944, state funeral in Ulm. The city was decked with swastika flags. The coffin, draped in the black-white-red flag of the Reich, was carried by 6 field marshals: Gerd von Rundstedt, Wilhelm Keitel, Heinz Guderian, Günther von Kluge, Werner von Blomberg, and Fedor von Bock. The eulogy was given by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, one of the Wehrmacht's oldest commanders. He said, Erwin Rommel's heart beat for the Führer and for the Reich. He fell as a hero, and we soldiers will remember him as a model of loyalty and courage. Hitler sent a wreath with a golden inscription, "To the fallen hero, Adolf Hitler." The wreath was placed on the coffin. None of the generals in attendance knew that inside that coffin lay a man killed on the orders of the one who sent the wreath. Only a year later, at the Nuremberg trials, Major General Bernhard von Lossberg, a former adjutant to Keitel, testified under oath, "I personally was present at a conversation between Field Marshal Keitel and General Jodl on October 15, 1944. Keitel said to Jodl, 'Rommel was given a choice. He chose the poison. The Führer is glad we didn't have to stage a public trial.' Jodl answered, 'That was the most humane solution possible.' I was shocked but said nothing." The total number of generals and admirals in the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine from 1939 to 1945 is 2,468. That's from the OKH Personnel Office data, declassified in 1972 and published in the West German Military Archive in Freiburg. Of them, irrevocable losses: 463 men. 184, 39.7%, died in combat from wounds in hospitals or in accidents at the front, plane crashes, mine explosions, friendly fire. The remaining 279, minus 60.3%, were non-combat losses. That category includes suicides, executions by military tribunal, death in captivity from starvation, disease, or murder by guards. Year by year, here's the trend. 1939 to 1941, 21 generals killed in action, only one recorded suicide. Major General Hans von Seckendorf, commander of the 17th Infantry Division, shot himself after the defeat outside Moscow in December 1941, unable to bear the shame of retreat. 1942, 44 combat deaths, 7 suicides. Most notable, after the 6th Army's surrender at Stalingrad in February 1943, several generals killed themselves in the Kessel rather than surrender, including General of Artillery Walter von Seydlitz-Kurzbach, who survived and later died in Soviet captivity, and General Major Hans Traut, committed suicide. 1943, 67 killed, 19 suicides. The year of Kursk and the retreat in Ukraine, suicides increased but were not yet massive. 1944, 39 killed, 84 suicides, the peak. Of the 84 suicides, 55 happened after July 20th. Of those, 38 were forced. The generals were given the choice, poison or the court. Only 17 were voluntary, generals who shot themselves without SS pressure, unable to bear the defeat. First half of 1945. 13 killed, 102 suicides. Of the 102, 87 were voluntary, 15 forced. So in 1945, as the front collapsed, most generals preferred a bullet to surrendering to the enemy. Comparison with World War I shows a monstrous gap. In the German Army of 1914 to 1918, 57 generals died. Only 4 suicides among them, a 70-fold increase. Historians explain this not only by the military collapse of 1945, but also by Nazi regime policies. In 1941, Hitler introduced so-called Nuremberg laws for the military. A general who surrendered was subject to a death sentence in absentia. His family lost all benefits. The pension was canceled. His children couldn't attend military academies. In 1944, after July 20th, Goebbels ramped up propaganda. Newspapers ran headlines like "Better heroic death than shameful captivity" and "A German general does not surrender." At the same time, Himmler circulated an instruction to senior officers: every general must carry a cyanide ampule. It is a matter of honor. Of the 279 non-combat losses, 123 are officially recorded as suicides. Autopsy reports and witness statements exist. 87 cases are listed as death by misadventure, a code for forced suicides where SS men killed the general, but it was filed as suicide, like Rommel. 43 generals were executed by the People's Court after July 20th. 26 generals died in captivity, from starvation, illness, or without trial, especially in Soviet captivity. By nationality among the dead generals, 412 Germans, 1937 boarders, 27 Austrians. After the 1938 Anschluss, they served in the Wehrmacht on equal terms. 24 Sudeten Germans from Czechoslovakia, annexed in 1938. The oldest dead general, General of Infantry Karl von Rox, born 1872, shot himself in April 1945 at age 73, not wanting to fall into Soviet hands. The youngest, Major General Theodor von Lutz, killed near Orsha in 1943 at age 36, blown up by a mine along with his staff car. These numbers show the scale of the catastrophe among the Wehrmacht High Command. No army in history lost its generals in such numbers and in such ways. The British Army in World War II lost 31 generals, the U.S. Army 45, the Soviet Red Army 458, but those are mostly combat losses, not suicides and executions. In the Wehrmacht, every third general who died in the war didn't die from an enemy bullet. Walter Model was no aristocrat like Rommel or Kluge. He was born January 24, 1891, in Genthin, a small town near Magdeburg, the son of a music teacher. His father, Otto Model, taught piano and choir at the local high school. His mother was from a peasant family. Walter was the fifth of 6 children. Money was tight, so he learned early to live an ascetic life. No drinking, no smoking, little sleep, working 16 hours a day. In 1908, he entered the Cadet Corps in Nice, the only way to get a military education without money. He served in WWI as an infantry lieutenant, was wounded 3 times, got the Iron Cross First Class. After the war, he stayed in the Reichswehr. Out of 200,000 officers, only 4,000 were kept. Model was a staff officer, wrote articles on tactics, developed concepts for combined arms. His career in the Wehrmacht took off thanks to tanks. In 1938, he became Chief of Staff of 4th Army Corps. In 1940, commander of the 3rd Panzer Division. In that role, he distinguished himself in the drive to Dunkirk. His division advanced 90 kilometers in 48 hours, captured 10,000 prisoners and 300 guns. Hitler called him to the Führer's headquarters and said, "Now that's a man with iron nerves. He stops at nothing." From that point, Model became a Führer favorite. By 1942, he was a colonel general commanding the 9th Army in the Rjev salient. By 1944, a field marshal, the youngest in the Wehrmacht at that time, 53. His mobile defense tactic worked like this: no continuous trench lines, instead strong points with anti-tank weapons and fast reserves. As soon as Soviet forces penetrated the defense, Model would immediately counterattack with small groups of tanks and infantry from the flanks, cutting off the spearhead from its main body. This meant Red Army offensives would bleed out in so-called meat grinders, like at Rzhev in 1942. Under Model, the 9th Army repelled 3 Soviet offensives: the Rzhev-Vyazma Operation, January 1942, the Pogorelo-Gorodishche Operation, August 1942, and Operation Mars, November to December 1942. Red Army losses in those battles. By some estimates, 300,000 to 400,000 dead and wounded. Ninth Army losses, about 40,000, a 10-to-1 ratio. For these successes, Model got oak leaves to the Knight's Cross and the nickname Hitler's Fireman. He was rushed to the most dangerous sectors of the front. But Model was not only a brilliant commander, he was also brutal. He personally signed orders for summary execution of deserters without trial, up to 50 men a day in the most intense fighting, with bodies hung from trees as a warning. His troops on the Eastern Front practiced scorched earth. Order number 002/43, January 12, 1943, signed by Model, read, "During retreat, destroy all populated areas in the line of march. Poison wells with kerosene or sulfuric acid. Blow up bridges and roads only after the last German soldier has passed. Evacuate civilians to the west. If they resist, shoot on the spot." That order later appeared in the Nuremberg materials as Exhibit USSR-476. By spring 1945, even Model skill wasn't enough. On April 1, 1945, Army Group B under Model's command was trapped in the Ruhr Pocket. 317,000 German soldiers, 85,000 horses, 1,200 guns, 250 tanks, all encircled by the U.S. 1st and 9th Armies under Generals Courtney Hodges and William Simpson. On April 5th, Simpson sent Model a surrender offer with guaranteed life and humane treatment under the Geneva Conventions. Model refused. On April 11th, General Matthew Ridgway, commanding the 18th Airborne Corps, sent a parlementaire with a letter. Ridgway wrote, "Field Marshal Model, your soldiers are starving. You have no ammunition. Your resistance is pointless. We guarantee you and your officers honorable treatment as prisoners of war according to the Hague and Geneva Conventions." Model read the letter, folded it, handed it back to his adjutant, and said, "I am still commanding an army. My answer is no." Why did he refuse? Historians give 3 reasons. First, Model knew well that the Allies had already declassified archival documents about Wehrmacht war crimes on the Eastern Front. His order number 002/43 was on the list of indictment evidence. If Model surrendered, he would face a military tribunal, and the sentence would be death, like General Jodl or Keitel. Second, Model knew about Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus's fate. Paulus surrendered at Stalingrad in January 1943. In retaliation, Hitler confiscated all of Paulus's property in Germany, and his wife and daughter were sent to Dachau concentration camp. They survived and were freed by U.S. troops in 1945. Model didn't want that for his family. Third, the Code of Honor. Model, despite his brutality, was an old-school Prussian officer. He believed a field marshal had no right to be captured. Better death, April 12th to 14th, 1945. Model's staff moved through the forests near Rattingen, about 20 kilometers from the Ruhr Pocket. 3 tents, 2 Kubelwagen cars, a radio running off batteries that lasted 2 hours. Almost no food. K rations, hardtack from 1943 that had to be soaked in water. Acorn coffee without sugar. Model slept on his greatcoat, using his field bag as a pillow. His adjutant, Major Ernst Günther Spiess, kept a diary later published in 1957 under the title The Last Days of Field Marshal Model. On April 14th, Spiess wrote, "The Field Marshal hasn't slept for 3 days. He sits by the fire and stares into the flames. I asked him what he sees. He said, Rzhev, Orel, Kursk. Everything we built has collapsed." Then he added, "Ridgway is clever." He wants to put me in a cage and take me around America like a zoo animal. I'm not giving him that pleasure. April 15th, 1945, 6 a.m. Model gathered the last staff officers, 8 men. He said, "I order you to break out east toward the Harz Mountains, where some units are still holding out. I am staying. I can no longer give orders that send men to their deaths. A field marshal's uniform must not fall into enemy hands. Dismissed." The officers were silent. Some wept. At 9 a.m., Model, Spiess, and 2 drivers, NCOs Fritz Düring and Werner Schaefer, walked 200 meters into the woods from the railway embankment of the Duisburg-Hagen line. Model carried his field marshal's baton in his right hand. He stopped at an old oak tree with a split trunk, looked up, said to Spiess, "There's a good branch here, but I won't hang myself. That's not soldierly. Hand me the pistol." Spiess gave him a Walther PPK, 7.65 millimeter caliber with 1 magazine, the same type of pistol used by Hitler for his own suicide 15 days later. Model took it, checked the cock. He said, "Step back 20 paces and turn your backs. I don't want you to see this." Spiess and the drivers moved away and turned. After a few seconds, they heard a shot. Spiess turned around. Model lay on his back under the oak tree. The pistol lay in the grass. The bullet had entered his mouth, passed through the palate, through the brain, and exited through the back of his skull, hitting the oak trunk at a height of 60 centimeters from the ground. The bark was blown open. A fragment of the bullet lodged there. Spiess walked over and closed Model's eyes. The drivers dug a shallow grave, only 70 centimeters deep because the ground was rocky and root-filled. The body was wrapped in Model's greatcoat and the field marshal's baton placed on his chest. They covered it with dirt. No cross, no marker. April 16th, Spiess surrendered to U.S. forces and immediately showed them the gravesite. U.S. soldiers exhumed the body, photographed it, identified it by dental records. Model had 3 gold crowns on his lower molars, confirmed by his personal dentist, Dr. Heinrich Schaefer, interviewed by military police. The body was moved to the military cemetery in Hürtgen and buried there on April 17, 1945. Plot 15, Grave 329. The inscription on the stone. Walter Model, General Feldmarschall, January 24, 1891 to April 15, 1945. The question many ask, did Model have a chance for acquittal if he had surrendered? The answer comes from German historian Jens Westermeier of the University of Freiburg, who studied Nuremberg documents for 15 years. Westermeier writes in his 2015 study, Model, the Lion of Defense, Myth and Reality. In 1946, the International Military Tribunal declared the scorched earth tactic to be a war crime. Model, as an army group commander, was directly responsible for the destruction of 312 populated areas in the USSR, including the cities of Orel, Kaluga, and Rzhev. Added to that were his orders for summary execution of deserters without trial, which violated international conventions. Model's sentence would have been death, likely by hanging, like Keitel and Jodl, so his suicide was not heroism. It was a calculated escape from the gallows. Where did German generals get the idea that death is better than capture? The roots go back to 18th century Prussia. King Frederick William I, who reigned from 1713 to 1740, issued the military article, the Prussian Army's legal code. Article 47 said, "An officer who surrenders a fortress or position without a fight shall be dishonored and sentenced to death. His body shall be given to the crows." His son, Frederick the Great, added in 1747, "An officer's honor is worth more than his life. Capture is disgrace." Better to die with a weapon in your hand than to live with the mark of a coward. In 1809, Major General Ferdinand von Schill, commander of the Berlin Hussar Regiment, was surrounded near Wismar. With no chance to break out, he shot himself with his pistol. A monument was erected in Berlin, still standing today. His example became a model for officer corps. In 1855, Lieutenant General Ludwig von der Tann, captured by the Austrians during the war over German hegemony, killed himself after being released, explaining in a suicide letter, "I cannot look the officers of my regiment in the eye. My face is stained by captivity." This code was passed down through generations in Prussian Cadet Corps, then the German Empire. By 1914, it was absolute norm. But in WW1, it was often ignored. Dozens of generals surrendered and weren't condemned. Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg, surrounded at Tannenberg, didn't shoot himself. He broke out and crushed the Russian army. And in 1918, when defeat was clear, no German general committed suicide. They signed the surrender and went home. What changed under Hitler? Two factors. First, the oath of personal loyalty to the Führer. From 1934, after President Hindenburg's death, Hitler merged the offices of Chancellor and President. All Wehrmacht officers took a new oath. "I swear by God this holy oath that I will render unconditional obedience to the Führer of the German Reich and people, Adolf Hitler, Supreme Commander of the Wehrmacht, and that I am ready as a brave soldier to risk my life at any time for this oath. Not to Germany, not to the Constitution, not to the people, to Hitler personally." Breaking that oath meant being a perjurer. In Prussian tradition, perjury was worse than death. Second, the threat to the family. On August 3, 1944, 2 weeks after the assassination attempt, Hitler signed the Decree on Family Responsibility for Traitors. The decree read, "If a general or senior officer surrenders without orders, flees to the enemy, or participates in a conspiracy, his wife and children under 18 shall be arrested and sent to a concentration camp. Property is confiscated to the state." This was no empty threat. Field Marshal Paulus's family, he surrendered at Stalingrad, spent February to April 1945 in Dachau. Colonel General Erich Hübner's family, executed for the conspiracy, was sent to Ravensbrück. His wife died of typhus in March 1945. Field Marshal Erwin von Witzleben's wife was arrested on July 25, 1944, and died on March 7, 1945, in prison from heart failure brought on by starvation. So when Bergdorf told Rommel, "Poison or your family goes to the camp," he wasn't bluffing. It was standard Nazi practice. Historian Christian Hartmann, author of Hitler's Officers, the Wehrmacht and the Dictatorship, 2016, analyzed 73 suicide letters of German generals from 1944 to 1945. The letters are kept at the German Federal Archives in Freiburg, file numbers N69/12 to N69/85. Results: 58 letters explicitly mention protecting the honor of the uniform, or I cannot taint the officer's name. 11 letters protecting my family, or only my death will save my wife and children from the camp. 4 letters unwilling to live in a world without the Führer, die-hard Nazis. Not a single letter admitting guilt for war crimes. Not one apologizing to the Soviet or American people. Not one urging future generations to avoid the same mistakes. The code of honor worked as a perfect shield. It let generals die with a clean conscience, without answering to history, without thinking about the millions who died because of their orders. Gunther von Kluge was born October 30th, 1882, in Poznan, to a Prussian general's family. An ancestor was Field Marshal Friedrich von Kluge, who served under Frederick the Great and fought in the Napoleonic Wars. Gunther knew from childhood his fate was the army. He entered Cadet Corps in 1901, graduated from the War Academy in 1912, WWI as a staff officer, reaching major. He stayed in the Reichswehr after the war. In 1938, when Hitler was expanding the Wehrmacht, Kluge commanded an army group in Prague during the annexation of Czechoslovakia. He was loyal to the Führer, faithfully followed orders. In 1941, commander of the 4th Army in Army Group Center, part of the advance on Moscow. It was Kluge who, in December 1941, forbade his troops to retreat during the Soviet counteroffensive, ordering the execution of anyone who left his position. For that, Hitler awarded him oak leaves to the Knight's Cross. But by 1944, Kluge, like many other generals, began to have second thoughts. The defeat outside Moscow, Stalingrad, the failure of Operation Citadel at Kursk, he could see the war was lost. Yet Kluge was a careerist. He didn't want to risk his neck. On July 15, 1944, 5 days before the assassination attempt, Major General Henning von Treschow, one of the conspiracy leaders, visited Kluge at his headquarters in France at La Roche-Guyon, a medieval castle on the Seine. Treschow said, "Field Marshal, we are preparing a coup. On July 20th, Stauffenberg will detonate a bomb at the Führer's headquarters. After Hitler's death, you will be commander-in-chief of the Western Front with dictatorial powers. Do you agree?" According to Treschow's recollections passed down through others, Kluge answered, "I need guarantees. If the assassination fails, I will be shot. If it succeeds, the Allies might still shoot me because I commanded troops in the East. I'll wait. Go ahead without me." He didn't inform the Gestapo about the plot, but he didn't help the plotters either. Classic weather-vane behavior, which earned Kluge his nickname from fellow officers. July 20th, the attempt failed. Hitler survived. The Gestapo began mass arrests. In Treschow's safe, he shot himself at the front on July 21st, 1944, on the Eastern Front near Ostrov Mazowiecka by pulling the pin on a grenade. A notebook was found with names and notes. Next to Kluge's name, it said, "In the know, waiting for a signal, undecided." On August 15th, 1944, Kluge was summoned to Berlin for a report to the Führer. It was, in fact, an arrest. Kluge understood. He didn't fly. Hitler had ordered his car cut off from all communications and banned him from air travel. Kluge drove from his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon toward Metz, a 3-car convoy. Kluge rode in the middle Mercedes-Benz 540K with tinted windows and armor plating. August 19, 1944, 10:30 a.m. on the N38 road near Verdun, close to where bloody WWI battles were fought. Kluge ordered the driver to stop at the sign for Dieu-sur-Meuse, 3 kilometers. He got out. His adjutant, Lieutenant Colonel Friedrich Stockhausen, handed him a leather briefcase. Inside was the suicide letter, written the night before on 4 pages of small handwriting using a fountain pen. Kluge walked 40 meters from the road into a field with tall grass. He sat down, leaning against an old oak. He took a cyanide ampoule from a secret pocket in his tunic. Wehrmacht generals often hid ampoules in cigarette holders or buttons. Kluge had a special button on his collar that unscrewed. Inside the button, a glass ampoule. He unscrewed it, bit down on the ampoule. Death in 48 seconds. Stockhausen ran up a minute later. Kluge was already blue, foam at his mouth, eyes rolled back. The body was taken to the nearest town, Dieu-sur-Meuse, then shipped back to Germany by train, arriving in Berlin on August 21st. Kluge's suicide letter to Hitler survives as a copy in the Nuremberg archives, document PS-3278. Kluge wrote, "My Führer, when you read this letter, I will no longer be alive. I cannot bear the accusation of treason. I have always served you faithfully and truly, as my decorations and my wounds attest. 4 wounds in WWI. But I see that the war is lost. The German people are suffering unbearably. Stop the slaughter before the entire country is destroyed. Your faithful von Kluge." Hitler read the letter at the Wolf's Lair on August 20th. According to Martin Bormann's diary, entry of August 20th, 1944, the Führer said, "Kluge died like a coward. If he'd been braver, he would have admitted his guilt and shot himself in front of his staff, on parade. Instead, he hid in a field under an oak tree like a tramp. Typical of his kind." Nazi propaganda announced on August 20th, 1944, Field Marshal Günther von Kluge fell a heroic death in an enemy air raid near Metz. He was buried in the family vault at the Kluge estate in Halberstadt. Kluge's wife, Matilda, received the pension but was placed under informal SS surveillance until the end of the war, forbidden to leave the estate. She lived in West Germany after the war and died in 1976 at age 92. Ludwig Beck and Erwin von Witzleben, 2 men who did not receive cyanide ampoules from Bergdorf. They stood trial, and their deaths were public and agonizing. Ludwig Beck was born in 1880 into an industrialist's family in Biebrich, entered Cadet Corps in 1898, served in WW1, reached general. In 1935, he became Chief of the Army General Staff, the second most powerful man in the Army after the Commander-in-Chief, Werner von Fritsch. Beck was an intellectual. Wrote books on military theory, translated B.H. Littlehart from English. It was Beck who in 1938, when Hitler announced the invasion of Czechoslovakia, wrote a 17-page memorandum arguing that war with the Western powers would lead to catastrophe. He resigned on August 18, 1938. Hitler accepted the resignation but did not publicly touch Beck. The general was too respected. From 1941, Beck became the spiritual center of the military resistance. He gathered around him generals discontented with Hitler, including Erwin von Witzleben, Erich Höppner, and Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel. He drafted the charter for a future government. In 1943, Beck developed Operation Valkyrie, the plan to seize power in Berlin after Hitler's death, using the reserve army to secure government buildings. July 20th, 1944, 4 p.m. Beck was in the Bendlerstrasse building in Berlin, the army headquarters, room 211. He was waiting for news from Stauffenberg. At 4:40 p.m., word came from Stauffenberg himself, who had just landed back in Berlin. Hitler was alive. Beck knew the plot had failed. He stood up, drew his Walther PP pistol, a 50th birthday gift from Field Marshal Keitel, engraved with the date June 27, 1940. He told the officers in the room, including Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, General Friedrich Olbricht, and Lieutenant Colonel Albrecht Merz von Quirnheim, "I will not fall into the Gestapo's hands. Farewell." His first shot went to his left temple, but his hand shook, either from stress or because he was 64 and hadn't fired a gun in years. The bullet grazed his temple, tearing skin and piercing his ear, but did not enter the skull. Beck fell to the floor, unconscious from shock and blood loss. He came to a few minutes later. Major General Friedrich Fromm, commander of the reserve army, entered the room. Fromm had just betrayed the conspirators and announced their arrest. He said, "Colonel General Beck, you are under arrest in the name of the Führer." Beck lay in a pool of blood but was conscious. He answered, "I don't have the strength for a second shot. Help me." Fromm turned to his adjutant, Captain Hans Jürgen von Kluge, no relation to the field marshal. "Leave him the pistol. He knows what to do." Fromm left. Beck raised the pistol to his chest, over his heart. The second bullet pierced his ribcage, nicked a lung, and lodged in his spine. Death from such a wound is not instantaneous. Beck took about 40 minutes to die, bleeding out on the floor of the headquarters. His body was taken to the morgue of the Charité Hospital in Berlin. Hitler ordered, "Photograph the body so everyone can see that the conspirator is dead. Then cremate without any honors. Scatter the ashes in an unknown place." And so it was done. Ludwig Beck's ashes were scattered in the ditches of Berlin. His wife, Emily Beck, was arrested on July 22, 1944, and sent to Ravensbrück concentration camp. She died on May 2, 1945, during the camp evacuation. A column of women was machine-gunned by SS guards as they marched toward Lake Schwedt. Her body was never found. She was 62. Erwin von Witzleben was born in 1881 in Breslau, now Wrocław, to an old Prussian family that had served in the army since the 17th century. He fought in WW1 and was badly wounded at Verdun in 1916, losing part of his left lung. In 1940, commanding the First Army, he broke the Maginot Line and captured 150,000 French soldiers. For that, Hitler promoted him to Field Marshal on July 19, 1940, during the famous ceremony in the Kroll Opera House. In 1942, Witzleben was forced into retirement for criticizing Hitler. He had openly said the two-front war was hopeless, and that the Führer was a madman leading Germany to ruin. In the July 20th plot, Witzleben was designated to become supreme commander of the Wehrmacht if the assassination succeeded. He was supposed to issue the Valkyrie orders from the Bendlerstrasse. When the failure became clear, Witzleben didn't shoot himself. He returned to his estate in Zossen, south of Berlin, hoping he would be left alone. A naive hope. The Gestapo arrested him on July 21, 1944, at 6 a.m. The People's Court trial was held on August 7th to 8th, 1944, in the Great Hall of the Berlin Court of Appeal. The judge, Roland Freisler, known for his cruelty and his red robes, screamed at the defendants, "You generals broke your oath. You are scum, cowards, traitors. You wanted to kill the Führer and betray Germany." Witzleben asked, "Let me remain in my uniform. I die as a soldier." Freisler replied, "You will die in your underwear, as befits traitors. Remove your uniform." Witzleben stripped to his long johns. Sentence: death by hanging. August 8, 1944, 6 p.m., Plötzensee Prison in Berlin. Witzleben and 7 other conspirators, including General Erich Hübner, General Paul von Hase, Lieutenant General Helmuth Stief, and others, were taken to the execution shed, a small brick building where a steel beam with 8 meat hooks had been installed. Butcher's hooks. Now they would hang people. The condemned were stripped to their underwear, hands tied behind their backs with wire, and then each was hoisted onto a hook by a rope around their necks. The ropes were thin, a 5mm hemp cord. Death did not come from a broken neck, but from strangulation, a slow agony lasting 12 to 20 minutes. A cameraman from the Reich Ministry of Propaganda filmed everything in close-up on Hitler's orders. The film was developed that same night. Hitler watched the film that same evening at the Wolf's Lair. His adjutant, Lieutenant Colonel Nicholas von Below, wrote in his diary, "The Führer was pleased. He said, These generals wanted to kill me. Now they got what they deserved. Too bad Freisler didn't sentence them to a longer agony. The bodies were not released to families. They were cremated in the Plötzensee ovens that same night, and the ashes scattered in the sewage ditches behind the prison. No graves, no markers. That was the end of a field marshal who had won one of the most brilliant campaigns of 1940. Witzleben didn't take poison like Rommel or Klug. He faced the court and died as a political prisoner. His wife, Erminia von Witzleben, was arrested on July 25, 1944, and sent to prison in Berlin. She died on March 7, 1945, of heart failure brought on by starvation and abuse. The exact location of her grave is unknown. April 1945. Berlin. The Reich Chancellery underground. Hitler's bunker smelled of dampness, gunpowder, sweat, and hopelessness. The generals still with the Führer lived in concrete cells 3 by 4 meters with no windows, slept on iron cots 2 or 3 hours a night, ate canned food and black bread. Among them was General of Infantry Hans Krebs, the last chief of the Army General Staff. Krebs was born in 1898 in Helmstedt, ended W.W. Wein as a lieutenant. In the 1930s, he served as military attaché in Moscow from 1933 to 1936 and learned to speak fluent Russian. He even translated Soviet military manuals into German. That made him the key figure in the final days. April 30th, 1945, 3:30 p.m. Hitler and Eva Braun killed themselves in the bunker. Hitler by gunshot and cyanide, Braun by cyanide alone. Goebbels, according to Hitler's last will and testament, became Reich Chancellor for 1 day, May 1st, 1945, 3:15 a.m. Krebs got orders from Goebbels to open negotiations with the Soviet forces. He mounted a motorcycle with a sidecar, a BMW R75, took a white flag tied to a wooden pole, and drove to the front line. He crossed the ruined Moltke Bridge over the Spree and stopped at a Soviet position near the corner of Schultestrasse. Red Army soldiers disarmed him and took him to the headquarters of the 8th Guards Army under Colonel General Vasily Chuikov. The headquarters was in the basement of a house on Schultestrasse, number 12, 300 meters from the bunker. Chuikov, hero of Stalingrad, who had commanded the 62nd Army in the city, met Krebs at 3:30 a.m. Krebs said in Russian, "General Chuikov, I am authorized by Reich Chancellor Goebbels to negotiate a ceasefire. Hitler is dead." Chuikov answered, "Only unconditional surrender, no ceasefire." Krebs, "We are ready to surrender to the Western Allies, but not to the Soviet Union. We propose a temporary truce to form a new government under Grand Admiral Dönitz." Chuikov, "We do not discuss a separate surrender. The Soviet command demands the signing of an act of unconditional surrender of all German troops on all fronts. That is Stalin's order." Krebs, "Let me return to the bunker and report to Goebbels." Chuikov, "You have half an hour." 5:45 a.m., Krebs got back to the bunker. Goebbels was already dead. He and his wife Magda had poisoned their 6 children with cyanide between 8 o'clock and 9 o'clock p.m. the previous evening, breaking the ampules in the sleeping children's mouths. And then at 8:30 p.m., they'd gone out into the Chancellery garden, where Goebbels shot his wife and then himself with his SS pistol. Krebs was left alone with Lieutenant General Wilhelm Burgdorf, the same Burgdorf who had delivered the poison to Rommel in October 1944. Now Burgdorf was chief of the Army Personnel Office and Hitler's chief adjutant. Both knew their names were on the NKVD blacklists. Krebs had signed the 1941 Commissar Order, Order Number 8, to shoot political commissars, a direct violation of international law. Bergdorf had personally been involved in organizing the executions of generals after July 20th, including selecting the meat hooks for Plötzensee. Surrendering would mean certain death by hanging or firing squad. May 1st, 1945, 12 p.m. The bunker was empty. Everyone who could leave had left. Some made it out through the Berlin subway tunnels. The U-Bahn, the U5 line tunnels from Brandenburger Tor Station toward Lehrter Station had been blown up by German combat engineers on May 1st at 4 a.m. to stop Soviet tanks from using them. Water from the Spree flooded the tunnels to a depth of 1.5 meters, but some officers still waded through the tunnels, waist deep in freezing water, and got out to the west. Others used the Landwehr Canal Collector, a drainage tunnel that led to the western suburbs. But Krebs and Bergdorf stayed. They sat in the bunker's mess hall, a 6-by-4-meter room with concrete walls, a plywood table, and broken chairs. On the table, open cans, pork and lard, a half-empty bottle of Metaxa brandy, captured from Greece in 1941, dirty glasses. They drank in silence. At around 1 p.m., Krebs stood up, drew his Walter PP. Bergdorf drew his Luger P08. They looked at each other. Neither said a word. Krebs put the muzzle to his right temple and pulled the trigger. Bergdorf shot himself in the mouth. The shots came almost simultaneously. Their bodies hit the concrete floor. Krebs died instantly. Bergdorf took a few seconds. The 9mm bullet shredded his cerebellum, but his body still twitched. May 2nd, 1945, 9 a.m. Soviet soldiers from the 35th Guards Rifle Brigade entered the bunker. They found 3 bodies: Krebs, Bergdorf, and one other general, unidentified, possibly General of Artillery Walter Buhl, but his fate is disputed. The bodies were dragged out into the Chancellery Garden. They were identified by their uniform insignia and by the identity cards found in their pockets. Krebs's card showed his rank and his promotion date of April 1st, 1945. On the order of Berlin's Commandant General Nikolai Berzerin, the bodies of Krebs and Bergdorf were taken away to an unknown destination. According to declassified KGB documents, CPSU Central Committee Archive, Fond 4, Opus 12, File 31, page 47. Declassified in 1991, they were cremated in 1946 in Magdeburg along with the remains of Goebbels and his family. The ashes were dumped into the Elbe River from the Magdeburg Bridge on the night of May 4th, 1946. No grave, no marker. That was the end of 2 men at the very top of the Nazi military machine. Krebs was a smart strategist. He had helped plan Operation Barbarossa. Bergdorf was a brutal executor. He had delivered death to Rommel and watched men hang. Both became victims of the system they had built. Their deaths in an empty bunker are the symbol of the total collapse of Hitler's Reich. We've only told some of their stories. The list of dead Third Reich generals is much longer. Erich Fromm, Colonel General, the one who betrayed the July 20th conspirators and arrested Beck, was himself arrested by the SS on February 21st, 1945 in Hagenburg. He was charged with cowardice and undermining military discipline. He'd had the conspirators shot without trial at the Bendlerstrasse, which was outside his authority as commander of the Reserve Army. Hitler didn't forgive even his own executioners if they stopped being brutal. Fromm was condemned to death by an SS court on March 7, 1945, and shot on March 12, 1945, at a fortress in Bavaria, the Forchheim garrison. His last words were, "I die for Germany. I have no regrets." Karl Heinrich von Stülpnagel, General of Infantry, conspirator, tried to shoot himself after the failure on July 20, 1944, near Verdun, the same road where Klug would later die. The bullet went into his eye, blinding him, but did not kill him. He was arrested, treated in a hospital in Berlin, specifically so he could be hanged in full health, then hanged at Plötzensee prison on August 30th, 1944. Friedrich Olbricht, general of infantry, one of the Valkyrie organizers, was shot in the courtyard of the Bendlerstrasse on the same night, July 20th, 1944, at 12:30 a.m. on July 21st. Albrecht Merz von Kirnheim, major general, executed there too. They all chose death over dishonor. Their names, erased by the Nazis, were restored by the Federal Republic of Germany in 1952. In Berlin, Bendlerstrasse was renamed Stauffenbergstrasse in 1955, and a memorial to the executed generals stands in the courtyard where they were shot. But that doesn't change the main thing. The death of these men was the logical end of the system they built. They swore allegiance to Hitler, they carried out his criminal orders, they bore responsibility for millions of deaths on battlefields and in camps. Their personal tragedies are just drops in the sea of suffering unleashed on Europe. Yet, by studying their fates, we see how a totalitarian machine works. It grinds up even those at the controls. Germany fell. But in the East, generals faced an equally terrible fate. Next episode: how Stalin dealt with the heroes of the Great Patriotic War. Why Marshal Georgy Zhukov came close to repeating Rommel's fate in 1946. What happened to Marshals Konstantin Rokossovsky and Ivan Konev, and why General Andrei Vlasov was the exception. Subscribe so you don't miss it. This is history they don't teach in textbooks.